Welcome to my video demonstration for the Dobby assignment. I'll be showcasing my cluster, a few little things here and there, and the failover to the replica. Kind of explain how things went. So here are my roles. I've got my domain controller virtual machine, which I've currently set to off in preparation for the failover to the replica. It is currently on failover 1. Replica server, which is the Hyper-V replica brokers on Dobby failover 2. My nodes, here we are Dobby failover 1, which is this VM, and Dobby failover 2, which is another. The storage disks, I have my witness disk and a cluster shared volume, which is housing the virtual hard disk for the DC that I converted over from the ESXi. The way I did that, I used the converter virtual machine that I made with a Starwind software, which I used to convert it from the hard disk image on an ESXi to a VHDX. It automatically went into my Hyper-V here. I made a blank virtual machine in Hyper-V without a hard disk that it just replicated its own hard disk into. The networks, here are my storage, my LAN, which connects all of the domain members, and my data. Yeah, I guess I will just showcase the replication. So it is going to be going over to the Dobby domain controller target on Dobby replica. And how I'm doing that, it has currently in the state of off. And I just go down here. I've already done this, so it's already in a preparation phase for the failover. I'm just going to go over to it on this one, replication, failover, start replication after virtual machine after failover. None of this is started, so I click failover. It will check the primary virtual machine is prepared, which is on the failover cluster. And then if everything is set up correctly, it will fail over and this will succeed. There we go. Failover completed successfully. And then if I just boot into this, and once that boots up, I'll just log in here. Already has my AD administrator account up. And if this worked properly, which it did, we can see me right there. There's my little guy Dobby. This was the image I put on my ESXi hosted nested domain controller originally. I then converted over onto the Hyper-V failovers with Starwind. I then replicated it onto this final Hyper-V server. As you can see, running right there. It successfully failed over. Even though it is not showing on here. I ran into so many problems with this assignment. I spent probably 30 hours this weekend setting it up originally, getting it through the migration from E6i to Hyper-V. That gave me a lot of problems. Starwind, I was using that, and I had originally tried to convert it when my domain controller was on. It failed because of that. I then ran it a second time with the domain controller off. It succeeded, but I had converted it into a VHD file, which is a Gen 1 format for a Gen 2 VM. So that failed. I reran Stormwind a third time, and it converted it, but the hard disk that it converted it to, the VHDX file, was corrupted, which is when I figured out I had to have a target virtual machine without a hard disk that it could replicate the hard disk into. That was my first big hurdle for this assignment. After that, I struggled with an iSCSI target configuration for a while. I eventually found out I had not assigned both failovers as initiators on my file server. I only had one in this. I only had the one for the failover 1, not for failover 1 and 2, so it could never have shared the storage. I then ran into the third issue, which was the first major issue, um, my failover was not properly configured with 3 NICs. I only had one NIC attached to all of my domain controller and the other domain members, and that caused problems because I should have had um, my data and my storage networks, and when I tried to add those manually by recreating NICs afterwards, it caused cluster errors, and I ended up having to delete all my VMs and start from scratch. That was the first time that happened. I then reset everything up a couple days ago and got back to the point where I had converted the VM with Stormwind properly this time, had my cluster all set up where the 3 NICs were on it, and my iSCSIs worked. I then tried to enable replication on the Dobby domain controller target, and it didn't work. I tried to create the replica broker, and it also didn't work. It would come up as a pending state forever and never actually run. That was because I had left my Hyper-V VM with, if the settings still show on here, or I had not checked enable this computer as a replica server. I hadn't enabled Kerberos for port 80. I hadn't enabled any authentication servers. But even after doing that, it still didn't work because, as I found out after remaking the entire cluster from scratch, not once, but 2 more times, and running into vastly different errors the whole way, I realized I had been logged in as my local administrator and not my domain administrator accounts for not just failover 1 and 2, but also the file server and the replica. I had only ever logged in as a domain admin on my domain controller, which I hadn't realized because I hadn't restarted any of my VMs after creating them and adding their roles. I then logged back in as a domain administrator on all of my virtual machines and tried to create the replica again and enable replication on Dobby domain controller target. This time it let me make the replica Hyper-V replica broker, but my domain controller target could not enable replication, and I could not figure out why. Eventually, I found out the error I was getting was due to my time being unsynced. When I had made my replica, I had made it after I created all my other VMs, and its time was off by 1 minute. I had to go into my domain controller on the Hyper-V on the failover and use I believe it was a W32TM resync to resync my domain controller's time with a time zone that I could access by giving it a NAT connection to the internet to set the time to link off of the windows.com time, and then resync all of my domain members with those commands and forcing it because it didn't like having no permissions. Once I reran that command on the replica to refresh its time zone, and I then finally got the successful replication enabled message. After that, all it took me doing was right-clicking this, turning it off, going down to replication, planning the failover, and then, as you saw in my demonstration, finishing the failover here. It took me probably closer to 50 hours working on this over the last week and a half. But I definitely have learned quite a bit on this. I'm much more comfortable. I set up yesterday when I remade my cluster and VMs from scratch for the third or fourth time. It only took me about 3.5 hours to get right back up to this point now. And I am, in the end, even though it was very frustrating, I'm grateful I got to have that learning experience. It'll prepare me for Brandon's clusterfuzz assignment very well. But yeah, that's just a few things that made this assignment a little bit harder than I expected. But I definitely I'm glad I got it out of the way. Thank you for your time. Hopefully this demonstration has hit all the marks. Yeah,